Detected.
Hey, I'm Retro Rob, and welcome to Coin Detected, where we dive into the history and legacy of 80s video arcade games and the people who built them. Visit coindetected.com to listen to the latest episode. Today's game is Asteroids. Asteroids is the classic space shooter that landed in arcades in late 1979 and immediately took the gaming world by storm. Developed and published by Atari, it became an icon of the golden age of arcades. In this episode, we're focusing exclusively on the original arcade version of Asteroids, the one with the glowing vector graphics and the simple yet heart-pounding gameplay that had players young and old pumping in quarters like mad. We'll explore how this game was created, the ingenious technical tricks that made it possible, the challenges the developers faced, and why Asteroids became such a cultural touchstone. We'll also share some gameplay tips, trivia, and world record exploits that helped cement Asteroids' legendary status. So grab a handful of quarters and strap in. We're about to warp back to 1979. To set the stage, it's the late 1970s at Atari's headquarters in Sunnyvale, California. The arcades are being dominated by Space Invaders, the smash hit alien shooter from Japan that stormed the scene in 1978. Atari, which basically launched the arcade craze earlier in the decade with games like Pong, is itching to reclaim the crown. Enter Lyle Rains, one of Atari's key game designers and vice president of engineering. Rains has an idea brewing for a new kind of space game. As he later described it, he envisioned a game about shooting rocks, asteroids specifically, a game of completion where you clear the screen of drifting objects, as opposed to the endless descending aliens of Space Invaders. He remembered an old internal Atari game concept that had been shelved. It involved two players flying around trying to shoot each other with a giant indestructible asteroid in the middle of the screen. Players in that prototype kept trying to shoot the big rock, even though it couldn't be destroyed, which told Rains that blasting asteroids had an undeniable appeal. In April of 1979, Rains pitched this rock-blasting game concept to one of Atari's talented engineers, Ed Logg. Ed Logg had joined Atari's coin-operated games division a few years prior, impressed by Atari's home console, the video computer system, and eager to make his mark in arcades. He had already co-developed Super Breakout and a never-released racing game, and he was known for his knack for refining gameplay. Upon hearing Rains' idea, Logg immediately clicked with it. He imagined a game where the player could shoot large rocks that would explode into smaller pieces, a cascade of targets that would need to be completely eliminated. The two brainstormed and realized they could combine elements from several influences: the free-roaming, two-dimensional space physics of Space War, the classic 1962 computer game, and Computer Space, the first arcade video game from 1971, the addictive Clear the Board objective from Space Invaders, and a dose of Atari's own Lunar Lander, a recent vector graphics game about landing a spacecraft, for the control scheme and hardware. By the end of the meeting, Rains and Logg were excited about the potential. They even agreed on the perfect name almost immediately: Asteroids. Now, Rains originally thought this new game might use raster graphics, the pixel-based graphics most games used. But Ed Logg had worked with Atari's vector graphics technology and felt vectors were the way to go. Vector graphics would allow brilliantly sharp lines and precise aiming, which he believed would make the shooting feel more accurate and satisfying. At the time, Atari had a new vector display system called Quadrascan, also known internally as the Digital Vector Generator, or DVG. This was the same hardware used in Lunar Lander, a monochrome XY display where graphics are drawn with beams on the screen, resulting in glowing line art instead of pixels. Logg was convinced that using this technology would give Asteroids a unique visual identity and a technical edge. Going against Rains' initial raster preference, he sought out the engineer behind the vector system, Howard Delman. Howard Delman had been instrumental in developing Atari's vector hardware. In fact, the original design for the vector graphics system came out of Atari's off-campus research lab, Cyan Engineering in Grass Valley, in 1978, and Delman had refined it for Lunar Lander. When Ed Logg approached him about Asteroids, Delman knew just what to do. He recalled that shelved prototype game called Cosmos, also known as Planet Grab, which already ran on a vector board. That prototype featured two ships fighting over planets and had that indestructible asteroid Rains mentioned, but it had been abandoned for not being fun. Delman literally pulled out its vector circuit board, thinking it would be an ideal starting point for Asteroids. Within a couple of days, Delman had put together a modified hardware development kit for LOG, essentially a lunar lander board that was tweaked and beefed up for Asteroids. This custom board included some critical upgrades. First, it had extra memory, a small daughter board of additional read-only MEMROM and random access memory, RAM, piggybacked onto the main board. Lunar Lander's hardware didn't have enough memory or storage for all the features Asteroids would need, so they expanded it. In total, the Asteroids arcade machine ended up with a mere 6 kilobytes of program ROM. Yes, just 6 kilobytes to hold all the game's code and graphics. And about 1 kilobytes of working RAM for the game variables. Even the vector drawing routines had their own dedicated memory, an additional 2 kilobytes of vector RAM and 2 kilobytes of vector ROM for storing the graphical data. To put that in perspective, a single simple image file on your phone today is larger than the entire Asteroids game program. Log and his team had to squeeze every bit of gameplay out of a few kilobytes, a true exercise in clever coding. And indeed, they coded it the old-school way, directly in 6502 assembly language, manipulating bytes and processor instructions by hand to make the game run smoothly on the limited hardware. The central processor on the Asteroids board was a MOS Technology 6502, running at about 1.5 megahertz. 1.5 megahertz. That's an extremely modest clock speed, even by standards of the early 80s. In fact, the 6502 alone was too slow to both compute the game logic and handle drawing the vector graphics in real time. To solve this, Atari's hardware design smartly offloaded the drawing work to the digital vector generator, the DVG, coprocessor. The 6502 CPU would compute the positions of asteroids, the ship, bullets, etc., and then write a list of drawing commands into a special area of RAM each frame. It would then signal the DVG, essentially saying, "Here's what to draw." The DVG, a custom state machine, would read those commands and directly control the monitor's electron beam to draw lines on the screen connecting specified points. This division of labor was cutting edge for its time, a bit like having a primitive GPU alongside the CPU. Thanks to this setup, Asteroids could render its distinctive wireframe asteroids, ship, and saucers smoothly, even as the game action got hectic. The vector monitor's resolution was effectively 24 by 768 points, far higher detail than most raster games of the era, which meant the graphics looked crisp and didn't pixelate when blown up. The downside was it could only display one color, in Asteroid's case, white, on a pure black background. But what a striking look it was. The objects glowed with an almost otherworldly intensity, and moving objects left a faint trailing glow due to the phosphor on the screen, an accidental but atmospheric effect that looked like a vapor trail following your ship. The visuals were simple, but they were mesmerizing. As one gamer decades later described, the shots and shapes on a vector screen nearly jump off the screen. They are so bright. While Delman was rigging up hardware, Ed Log started crafting the game itself. He sketched out the core design on paper, literally handwriting what the game should do, even before a single line of code was written. In an amazing bit of history preservation, those original design notes still exist. They now reside at the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, New York, and they show that the final game ended up almost exactly as Log first described. The basic concept was straightforward. The object of the game is to destroy the asteroids and saucers. Shooting a large asteroid would break it into 2 medium-sized ones, and shooting a medium asteroid would break it into 2 small ones. Clear all the asteroids, and a new wave begins. It sounds simple, but getting the gameplay balance just right took a lot of iteration and skill. Log later recalled just how intensely he lived and breathed this project. He said, "I was shooting the asteroids all night long. I just play the game over and over and over in my head. I play a lot of the games in my mind long before I ever write them, because you have to get all the interactions down pat before you can start programming. I know what it's going to look like before I even get there." This vivid quote gives us an idea of Ed's mindset. He practically inhabited the asteroids world during development, mentally simulating space battles to fine-tune the mechanics. One major element Log tweaked was the physics of the player's ship. Inspired by space war, the ship in Asteroids obeys a sort of thrust and drift inertia. You turn your ship with left-right rotate buttons, hit the thrust button to propel forward, and once moving, you continue gliding until friction, simulated in code, slows you down. Finding the perfect feel for the ship's inertia and drag was crucial. At one point, Log tried making space totally frictionless, meaning once you sped up, you'd drift indefinitely until thrusting opposite. But that made the game too easy and somewhat out of control. On the flip side, he tested cranking the friction way up. The ship would stop almost immediately when you stopped thrusting, but that made it too punishing. Players kept stopping short and accidentally crashing, which felt unfair. In the end, he settled on a gentle middle ground. The ship has a satisfying glide that feels like drifting through space, yet there's just enough friction that you eventually slow down if you stop thrusting. This balanced inertia gives players both a sense of freedom and the need to skillfully control momentum, which is a huge part of Asteroids' appeal. The control scheme for Asteroids utilized 5 buttons: rotate left, rotate right, thrust, fire, and hyperspace. There was no dedicated joystick. It was all buttons on a flat panel. Edlog actually borrowed this 5-button setup straight from Atari's Lunar Lander, which also had rotation and thrust controls. However, a funny tidbit, Log wasn't entirely happy with the layout of the hyperspace button on the cabinet. It wasn't near his right thumb. The thrust and fire were more central, and he later commented that he found it awkward because he had to take his hand off thrust to hit hyperspace. But by and large, the controls worked great. Players could maneuver the little ship with surprising precision after some practice, lining up shots and dodging debris. One of the most innovative, and now standard, features Asteroids introduced was the concept of a high score table with player initials. In the late 70s, most arcade games either didn't record high scores at all, or if they did, they just showed the score values until the machine was turned off. Asteroids was among the first to let you enter your initials and permanently display the top scores, giving players everlasting glory, at least until someone beat their score. Ed Log got this idea from a prior game, a relatively obscure 1979 space shooter called Starfire by Exidy, which had a high-score initial entry feature that impressed him. He implemented it in Asteroids, and it became a major draw. Gamers loved the competitive aspect of seeing AAA or Tim or Bob at the top of the list and trying to knock each other off. That might sound basic now, but it was revolutionary in 1979. It gave Asteroids a ton of replayability because bragging rights were on the line every time you put in a coin. Asteroids audio is another interesting technical story. The game has no dedicated sound chip. Sound in Asteroids is generated by all analog circuitry on the board. Essentially, for each sound effect, of which there were about 13 in the game, engineer Lyle Rains and Atari's sound designers created a little analog circuit using components like resistors, capacitors, and logic chips that would produce a tone or noise when triggered. These were things like the thump-thump of the background beat, the crackling explosion sounds, the firing noise, the saucer's warbling tone, etc. Howard Delman himself wired a lot of this audio circuitry by hand on the Asteroids prototype board. The result was a distinctive soundscape that is totally hardwired. No digital samples here, just electronics making noise. And boy, did it work effectively. Perhaps the most iconic sound in Asteroids is the heartbeat audio. As you whittle down the asteroids on screen, the background thumping sound speeds up, like a heart racing faster and faster. It creates incredible tension in the player. Everyone who's gotten down to that last rock knows the stress of that thump, thump, thump accelerating. It was a brilliant dynamic soundtrack that responded to gameplay and kept players on edge. By summer of 1979, Ed Log had a working prototype of Asteroids that Atari employees could playtest. It was immediately clear they had something special. People in the company found themselves drawn to the game, eager to top each other's scores. The combination of simple rules and engaging physics was addictive. One notable thing testers discovered was a clever strategy, or shall we say, an exploit, that expert players could use to play essentially forever. Atari's testers noticed that if you kept one or two asteroids alive at the end of a wave, instead of clearing them all to trigger a new wave, you could lurk around and wait for the flying saucers to appear, then pick them off for extra points. The small flying saucer that appears once your score is high is worth a lot of points, 1,000 points each, and skilled players found that by hanging around the screen edges opposite from where the saucer appears, they could shoot it safely and not get hit because the saucer's aim isn't good across the screen boundary. Then they'd wait for the next saucer and do it again. Essentially, by never destroying the last asteroid, you could avoid triggering a new, harder wave and instead farm points indefinitely from the saucers. This became known as the lurking strategy. Great for players, not so great for arcade operators who wanted people to lose and pay to play again. When asteroids hit arcades, savvy gamers used this exploit to marathon the game for hours on a single quarter, racking up huge scores. Once Atari realized this during testing, they actually took action. They issued a modified ROM game chip update to arcade operators, which tweaked the saucer behavior to make lurking harder. The updated program made the saucers a bit smarter and more aggressive to discourage the strategy of hanging out off-screen. This was one of the earliest examples of a video game patch issued specifically to stop a revenue-killing exploit in the wild. It also taught Atari and other companies a lesson: to playtest not just for bugs, but for gameplay loopholes that hardcore players could abuse. Many credit this incident with changing how games were balanced in the arcade era. Developers became much more aware of what expert players might do. Asteroids was completed and ready for release by November 1979. Atari field-tested it in a few local arcades and bars, as was their practice to ensure a game would perform well. The response was instantaneous and electric. Players flocked to the machine. In one location, the story goes, Asteroids was so popular that it completely eclipsed the earlier game's sharing space on the floor, which might have been a lunar lander. In fact, demand for Asteroids in those early days was so high that Atari made a pragmatic decision. They converted some of their existing lunar lander arcade cabinets into Asteroids machines to fill orders. Lunar Lander had been Atari's first vector game, released just a few months prior, but it was a more slow-paced, limited-appeal game. Once operators saw how much money Asteroids was earning, they were more than happy to swap out Lunar Lander. Atari literally shipped several hundred Asteroid circuit boards to arcades, instructing operators that they could install them into their unsold or low-performing Lunar Lander units. Voila! Instant Asteroids cabinets. This was unusual at the time, but it underscored how Asteroids was an instant hit. When Asteroids officially launched, it came in two main cabinet styles: the standard upright arcade cabinet with a vertical screen and the controls at a waist-high panel, and a cocktail table version, a smaller, sit-down table with a horizontal screen under glass, where two players could sit on opposite sides and take turns. The screen would flip for player two's turn. There was also a less common mini cabaret model, a smaller upright for locations with less space, that some sources mention Atari produced, though official records mainly list the upright and cocktail. The upright machine's art is iconic, a bold, colorful marquee that says Asteroids with a spaceship blasting rocks, and side panel art showing a spaceship flying amid asteroids. But inside that flashy cabinet was the real magic: that vector monitor and bespoke hardware we discussed. From the get-go, Asteroids was a money-making monster in arcades. The glowing screen attracted players like moths to a flame. Arcade operators reportedly had to empty the coin boxes multiple times a day because they were overflowing with quarters. It was so popular in some venues that operators even installed bigger coin boxes to hold the massive number of coins players were feeding in. Imagine that for a moment. A single Asteroids machine bringing in so many quarters that the standard cash box just couldn't cope. It speaks to the mania Asteroids created. By early 1980, Asteroids was officially the hottest game in the United States. At the 1980 AMOA, Amusement and Music Operators Association, trade show, the big convention for the coin-op industry, the trade magazine Playmeter presented Atari with an award for video game excellence for Asteroids, citing it as the highest-earning arcade video game of the year. This was no small feat, as it was quickly joined by other hits like Pac-Man in that year, but Asteroids truly ruled the roost for a time. In fact, Asteroids essentially knocked Space Invaders off its throne in North America. As one retrospective article put it, Asteroids single-handedly broke the stranglehold that Space Invaders had on the video game world. In other words, it catapulted Atari back to the top of the arcade heap and proved that an American-made game could go toe-to-toe with the Japanese imports that had dominated late '79. Let's talk numbers. And remember, we'll keep them spelled out since this is audio. Atari's production records indicate that they built around 47,840 upright Asteroids cabinets and about 8,725 cocktail units pinrepair.com. That alone sums to roughly 56,000 machines, but the demand went even beyond that. In a 1981 court case, Atari stated that they had sold around 70,000 Asteroids games by that time. That likely includes additional units and perhaps international licenses, but either way, it's a staggering figure. To put it in perspective, those sales brought Atari roughly $125 million in revenue by late 1981. Keep in mind, this is just Atari's sales of the machines to arcade operators. The real money was made one quarter at a time by the arcades themselves. It's estimated that collectively, players dropped about $500 million in quarters into Asteroids machines over the years. Yes, $500 million in 25-cent coins. Asteroids essentially printed money for operators. It became Atari's best-selling arcade game of all time, a title it holds to this day. The cultural impact of Asteroids was massive. Suddenly, vector graphics were the new cool thing. That greenish glow in a dark arcade had a futuristic allure. Other game designers were influenced by Asteroids' mechanics and success. Eugene Jarvis has cited Asteroids as an influence when he created Defender in 1980. Defender's looping wraparound world and multi-directional shooting owe a debt to Asteroids. Atari itself quickly followed up with Asteroids Deluxe in 1980, a sequel that added a killer satellite obstacle and replaced the hyperspace button with a temporary shield feature. Deluxe was a modest success, but not quite the phenomenon the original was. It sold about 18,000 units, a lot, but a fraction of the original Asteroids, pinrepair.com. Atari continued to iterate on the vector shooter idea with Space Duel in 1982, a colorful vector game that was essentially a two-player co-op evolution of Asteroids, and later Blasteroids in 1987, which was a more modern, raster graphics reimagining of the concept. But none of these sequels ever eclipsed the classic Asteroids in the public's heart. With success, however, also came imitators and even legal battles. Arcades were flooded with knockoffs and clones trying to capitalize on the shoot the rocks craze. One clone in particular, a game called Meteors, made by a small company named Amusement World, was so similar to Asteroids that Atari's lawyers took action. In 1981, Atari sued Amusement World for copyright infringement, arguing that Meteors was a blatant ripoff of Asteroids. This led to one of the first major legal cases about video game cloning. The case, Atari Inc. v. Amusement World Inc., was closely watched as it posed the question, can the gameplay of Asteroids be protected by copyright, or just the specific graphics and code? In the end, the court denied Atari's injunction and ruled in favor of the defendants. The reasoning was that while Asteroids was copyrighted, the idea of a spaceship shooting asteroids in space was a concept, and Meteors had different-looking graphics. It used raster graphics and color, for instance. Atari lost the case. This was an early precedent that essentially said game ideas or rules can't be copyrighted, a ruling that has echoed through gaming history. Atari was disappointed, of course, but they publicly vowed to use their war chest to fight piracy in other ways going forward. It's interesting trivia that a working Meteors arcade cabinet, the game from this lawsuit, was unearthed many years later as a piece of history, a reminder of how hot the Asteroids craze was that it triggered a landmark legal battle. Despite clones, Asteroids' legacy remained untarnished. It became a pop culture icon, referenced in TV shows, music, and of course later video games. Many games in the space shooter genre borrow from its basic mechanics, and the image of a little triangular spaceship blowing apart drifting rocks is instantly recognizable even today. In 2024, Asteroids received one of the ultimate honors in gaming. It was inducted into the World Video Game Hall of Fame, run by the Strong National Museum of Play. The Hall of Fame induction cited how Asteroids made a simple yet challenging game about blasting rocks into one of the most widely played and influential video games of all time. They also noted that Asteroids helped Atari sell millions of home consoles, since the home version, though we won't delve into ports here, was extremely popular. Truly, Asteroids' influence has been stellar. Now, let's get a bit more visual, in an audio sense, and describe the actual gameplay and appearance of Asteroids, for those who might not have seen the original in a while. Close your eyes and imagine a classic upright Asteroids cabinet in a dimly lit arcade. The screen is a jet black void, the depths of space. There's no star field, nothing but an empty darkness. Suddenly, white geometric shapes drift into view, the asteroids. Each asteroid is depicted as an irregular polygon, basically a multi-sided outline that looks hand-drawn and rocky. They come in three sizes: large boulders, medium fragments, and small shards. At the start of a level, a few large asteroids materialize and coast slowly across the screen. They tumble end over end. The outlines rotate, showing their uneven shapes, and drift in random directions. The player's ship is a tiny triangle at the center of the screen. That's your rocket ship, a simple vector outline of a delta-wing craft. It's small and relatively fragile-looking. When you rotate left or right, the ship spins instantly to point in that direction. Press thrust, and a little triangular flame appears out of the back of your ship, a cute little puff of rocket exhaust, and you hear a thrusting noise as you start gliding forward. Fire the gun, and pew! A bullet, drawn as a single dot, streaks out from the tip of your ship. You can only have a handful of bullets on screen at once to limit stress on the hardware and gameplay balance, so you can't just hold the fire button, you have to time your shots. When a bullet hits an asteroid, the rock splits apart with a crunchy explosion sound. The large asteroid breaks into two medium ones, which shoot off at perpendicular angles, now moving faster than the big one was. Hit a medium, and it shatters into two small ones, which are faster still. The small asteroids, once hit, are completely destroyed and vanish in a satisfying on-screen explosion of light. Clearing the screen of all asteroids will bring a momentary calm, and then a new batch of large asteroids will pop in, starting the next wave. With each new wave, typically there are more asteroids, and they might start at higher speeds, making the game progressively more difficult until it maxes out in challenge around the 10th wave or so. But asteroids aren't your only concern. As you're busy dodging and shooting space rocks, periodically a flying saucer invades the playfield. There are two types of saucers: a big saucer and a small saucer. The big saucer isn't too bright. It flies across the screen in a straight line, shooting randomly. Its shots are wild and often not even close to you. It's mostly a nuisance and points opportunity. However, once you reach a certain score threshold, in the original programming, after you hit 40,000 points, only the small saucers will appear going forward. And those little guys are deadly. The small saucer is tiny, not much larger than your ship, and it zips across the screen, often appearing from a random edge. It fires shots rapidly, and its aiming gets better the higher your score climbs. At first, the small saucer's bullets have a wide scatter. They might miss you by a mile. But if you survive and keep scoring, the saucer's aim narrows until it's practically sniping at your current position with scary accuracy. That escalating difficulty keeps even expert players on their toes. One moment you're leisurely picking off slow rocks, the next you hear that alarm-like saucer sound, and suddenly you're in a high-speed dogfight with a ruthless little UFO. One really neat aspect of Asteroids' gameplay space is that it's topologically a toroid. In simpler terms, the edges of the screen wrap around to the opposite side. If your ship or an asteroid goes off the right edge, it instantly reappears on the left edge at the same trajectory, same for top to bottom. This wraparound effect means the playfield is continuous. Nothing ever truly leaves the screen. It just loops around. For gameplay, it means you have to keep an eye on not just what's in front of you, but what's wrapping around behind you. An asteroid drifting off the bottom might suddenly pop in at the top near you if you're not careful. This was a relatively novel concept at the time and contributes to Asteroids' unique feel. Space is not bounded by the screen, it's connected. Graphically, aside from the rocks, ship, and saucers, there isn't much else on the screen. It's elegantly sparse. You have a score display at the top in simple text, and typically it shows your score, the high score, and how many lives you have left, often depicted as little extra triangle ships. When you lose a life by getting hit by an asteroid or a saucer's shot, your ship explodes into a bright cluster of vector shards. Then a new ship will appear, accompanied by a brief hum sound, and you continue if you have lives remaining. Extra lives are usually earned every 10,000 points by default settings, a generous system that allows skilled players to accumulate a lot of lives for marathon sessions. The game only displays 5 digits for score, and it rolls over at 99,990 points back to 0. So if you're ever watching someone play Asteroids and their score suddenly shows something small again, they might have actually broken 100,000 and rolled it. In competitive settings, players have to keep track of how many times they rolled the score over. Now, if you were hanging around an Asteroids machine in 1980, you'd likely encounter 2 types of players. The casual player who zips around, maybe mashes that hyperspace button every time they're in a pickle, and has fun until inevitably an asteroid or saucer gets them around a few thousand points. And then the serious player, the one who has seemingly mastered Newtonian motion in microgravity and can play seemingly indefinitely. What separates the novices from the experts in Asteroids? A few key strategies and skills. First, positioning. New players often try to fly all over the place, which usually spells doom because you can easily sail into a rock. Skilled players generally adopt a strategy of staying near the center of the screen and only thrusting in short, controlled bursts. By hovering near the middle, you give yourself maximum reaction time to shoot or dodge asteroids coming from all directions, and you minimize surprises from wraparound. One common tip was, stay still unless you need to move. In fact, some of the best players basically do not thrust at all once the rocks are manageable. They only move if absolutely necessary. That way, you're a steady turret blasting everything around. Second, aim and rate of fire. Because you can only have a limited number of bullets in play, an expert times their shots rhythmically to always have a bullet about to hit a target or be cleared so the next shot can fire. There was even a technique players developed known as double tapping, or a rapid 2-finger trigger on the fire button. Some players would use 2 fingers in quick succession on the single fire button to fire bullets faster than 1 finger could tap, essentially achieving a higher effective firing rate. This could be useful to quickly blast a cluster of small asteroids or to nail a fast-moving saucer. It's a manual dexterity trick that only seasoned arcade goers might know, like playing a musical instrument. Third, target prioritization. A casual player might shoot at whatever's nearby. A seasoned Asteroids player, however, knows you should often take out the big asteroids first to break them up early, but also not leave too many small fast bits flying around at once. There's a balance. You don't necessarily want to splinter everything into a storm of tiny, hard-to-hit rocks all at the same time, or you'll be overwhelmed. Experts often develop a sense of clearing one section of the screen at a time, reducing the asteroid count methodically. They might also decide to leave one harmless medium asteroid drifting slowly while they focus on an incoming saucer, as dealing with both a saucer and a field of fast-moving small rocks is the deadliest scenario. Fourth, the hyperspace button, which I haven't talked much about yet. That hyperspace function is a panic button. When pressed, your ship vanishes and instantly reappears in a random position on the screen. Sounds life-saving? Well, it comes with risks. You might rematerialize right on top of an asteroid, which kills you, or the ship might even blow up immediately from the stress of jumping. Some versions implement a small random chance of ship malfunction on re-entry. It's truly a last resort. Newer players love to smash that hyperspace the moment things get hairy, often with disastrous results. Veteran players, on the other hand, rarely use hyperspace. They know it's far better to rely on skillful flying than a dice roll that could teleport you from the frying pan into the fire. In competition or marathon play, hyperspace is almost entirely avoided unless there is absolutely no other escape. And we already discussed the lurking strategy earlier, leaving one asteroid alive to hunt saucers, which was the hallmark of marathon world record play. Outside of the official patch scenario, many players in the wild still use that tactic to maximize scores. What they do is eliminate all but one small asteroid, then keep that one rock floating around. The game would keep sending saucers at intervals since the wave wasn't over. The player would carefully dodge or stay opposite the screen from the saucer and snipe it over and over, racking up points. This requires patience and precision, but it's the key to astronomical scores. Arcade owners, once wise to it, would often tweak their machines to the updated ROM that made saucers more aggressive, or they'd set the machine to a harder difficulty, just to thwart this practice and restore the balance of the game and their earnings. We can't talk about Asteroids without mentioning the world records and high-score heroes that emerged. Asteroids, like a few other early arcade titles, became famous for marathon gaming sessions, since a skilled player could play indefinitely, especially using the lurking exploit, and stockpile lives. People began pushing how long and how high they could play on one credit. The very first officially recognized world record on Asteroids was set by a gentleman named Leo Daniels of Carolina Beach, North Carolina. On February 6, 1982, Leo Daniels scored 40,101,910 points on Asteroids. This was achieved in a marathon session that reportedly lasted over a day and a half of nearly continuous play. Daniels' record was reported by Twin Galaxies and Atari at the time as the benchmark to beat. And beat it, someone did, later that same year. On November 13, 1982, a 16-year-old from Cherry Hill, New Jersey, named Scott Safran took on the Asteroids High Score Challenge. Safran played at the All-American Billiard Company arcade in Newtown, Pennsylvania, and after a grueling continuous play, rumored to be around 60 hours long, played over several days with only brief pauses between reserved extra ships, he achieved a score of 41,336,440 points. This astonishing feat set a new world record, surpassing Leo Daniels' score, and it was recognized by Atari and Twin Galaxies as the official world record on Asteroids. Safran's record stood as the high score for an incredible length of time. In fact, it became the longest-standing video game world record on a major title. For over 27 years, no one officially toppled Safran's score. Tragically, Scott Safran never got to see anyone challenge his score. He passed away in an accident in 1989, not even a decade after setting his record. His story became legend among classic arcade fans. Twin Galaxies founder Walter Day spent years trying to locate Safran in the 90s to honor him, not realizing he had died. Safran had effectively disappeared from the public eye after his 1982 triumph. It wasn't until 2002 that his fate was discovered, and he was posthumously honored for his achievement. Finally, in April 2010, that hallowed high score was exceeded by a gamer named John McAllister from Seattle, who live-streamed a marathon and scored just over 41,838,740 points after 58 hours of play. The fact that it took nearly 3 decades and the era of internet streaming for someone to finally beat Safran's score speaks to how masterful those early players were. As Walter Day quipped, Safran's unbroken 27-year record was like Joe DiMaggio's hitting streak, a piece of history. A few more bits of trivia and myth surround Asteroids. One rumor that circulated among players is that some early units of Asteroids had an invincible ship glitch. Allegedly, in the very first software revision, the one that displayed Asteroids by Atari on the screen instead of the later 1979 Atari message, a bug could allow your ship to become immune to collisions under certain rare circumstances. This was never officially confirmed in the wild and likely was fixed quickly, but tales of an invulnerability glitch persisted, those kinds of playground rumors that many games of the era had. Another fun fact, Asteroids was one of the games featured in that wave of early 80s media coverage of video game champions. Asteroids record setters got spots on TV shows. For example, after Greg Davies set an unofficial marathon record of 10 million points in July 1980, playing over 21 hours straight, he got to appear on a Nickelodeon talk show in 1981, allencolorforaquarter.blogspot.com, allencolorforaquarter.blogspot.com. Arcades even held Asteroids tournaments. It was truly a game that helped push competitive gaming forward. Asteroids also left a legacy in the DIY and modding community. Because the game's hardware and code are so beloved, hobbyists have kept these machines alive and even enhanced them. Some enthusiasts have created multi-game kits that let an original Asteroids cabinet switch between Asteroids and Asteroids Deluxe or other vector games, so they can preserve one cabinet and play multiple classics. Others have done amazing hardware mods. One modder famously built a custom circuit to add color to the Asteroids display. By hacking the vector beam intensity controls and using a special monitor, they managed to make the Asteroids different colors, something the original hardware was never designed to do. It's a testament to Asteroids' enduring appeal that people are still tinkering with it, finding new ways to experience that rock-blasting action. Before we wrap up, let's not forget to mention the human side. The developers behind Asteroids have spoken fondly of it in retrospect. Lyle Raines, who kicked off the project, once humorously described his and Ed Logg's roles in a rather familial metaphor. He said, "I guess the way I describe it is that I'm the father of Asteroids. Ed Logg is the mother of Asteroids, because he had to live with it for 9 months and deliver the finished product. All I had to do was provide a seed." This chuckle-worthy quote really highlights how Raines had the initial concept, but Ed Logg carried it through the long, hard labor of development. And indeed, Ed Logg's baby Asteroids turned out to be one beautiful creation. The success of Asteroids helped cement Ed Logg's legendary career at Atari. He went on to design or co-design other hits like Centipede, Gauntlet, and more. But Asteroids was really the game that put his name on the map in arcade history. Summing up Asteroids' legacy, it was a game of firsts. One of the first to save initials, one of the first vector hits, Atari's first game to really challenge the reigning king, Space Invaders, and win, and the game that ushered in a wave of geometry-based shooters. Its simple white graphics belied a depth of play and a technical sophistication for the time that earned it both player love and industry respect. It's no wonder that here we are, over 40 years later, still talking about Asteroids in reverent tones. Many of us have memories of seeing that game for the first time and being transfixed by the glowing rocks, or of finally figuring out how to control the ship without crashing, or the triumph of entering our initials on the high scoreboard. It's a game that has truly stood the test of time. And that's it for this episode of Coin Detected. I do my best to get all the facts right, but there are literally thousands of video arcade games from the 80s, so if you heard me make an error, tell me about it, and I'll correct and re-upload the episode. This is Retro Rob, and you can reach me at coindetected.com. This episode is over, but the game never ends. See you at the arcade.
The sequence is complete. Game over.